Good evening and welcome to our telematics session. This is for the module Educational Research. With me this evening I have Crystal Anton, which I'm sure many of you already know, and you've had contact with her via email as well as via the telephone. We know that you made the right decision to be here this evening. There's nothing better that you can do than to be here between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. I know that the movies are half price, I think, on a Tuesday evening, but you've made the right decision to be here. What we're going to do this evening is to take you through some aspects of the module. We want to try and make it as interactive as possible. So we would also like you to phone in with your questions and ask us different questions and so on. And you can do that at any particular time as we move on. We will try and engage you as well to make the session interactive, and we don't want to exactly repeat what was done in April, because many of you would have listened to Crystal's presentation earlier in the year. So I just left Crystal's contact details there for you again, so if we can just look at that. So Crystal's telephone number is there, as well as the email address, and you can contact her during the week with any of your queries and with any assistance that you need, including assistance with your assignment, which is a mini project which you must do. So let us continue and just look at how we're going to arrange our session here. So the first session will be up till about 5 to 7, and then we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back after the break, and then we will go on with our second session until about 8 o'clock. So what I decided to do was to just start again by saying that when you look at research very generally, then broadly we can divide research in the social sciences or in the educational sciences into research that is theoretical or philosophical. Other words that we use would be normative research or speculative research. And this kind of research involves using logical arguments, making claims, and then building an argument by using, different kinds of justifications in support of that particular argument. So it's based on a rational way of thinking, and a logical way of formulating your arguments. Now, if you look at the second type of research, which we call empirical research. Now, what empirical means, if we can go to the slide, what empirical means is that it's research where you use your senses. Or you might use what we call the extension of your senses. If you think about research that's done in the natural sciences and so on, what natural scientists do is they often extend the powers of the senses by using instruments. So, for example, if you look at what you can observe with your eyes, the natural scientists would use a microscope, they would use a telescope, and all kinds of different instruments that that's useful in extending the powers of the senses. So empirical work will also include work involving instruments that we develop that extends the use of our senses, and that might be, in certain instances, questionnaires used in standardized tests, for example, when one would measure something like IQ, intelligence. That would be one example. One can use attitudinal scales where you measure people's attitudes about a particular issue. So that's the distinction between theoretical or philosophical research and empirical research. I thought that's a useful distinction to firstly make. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to put up a question for you, and then I want you to think about that. Look at the question carefully and think about whether that question is an empirical question or whether that's a theoretical question. Now, some people tell me, I'm not too sure about this, that corporal punishment is still it's a fairly widespread practice in schools, even though it's illegal. I'm not going to go into all of those details, but if I ask the question, how widespread is the practice of corporal punishment in Western Cape schools? Just read that question carefully and think about it. What I then want you to do is to decide whether you think that is a theoretical question or whether that is an empirical question. What I would then like you to do is to SMS your answer. If you think it is a theoretical question, then you just SMS 1. If you think it's an empirical question, then you SMS 2. So if you could do that, then we can then take the discussion further from there. So the question is, how widespread is the practice of corporal punishment in Western Cape schools? Is that particular question a theoretical question or is it an empirical question? Bearing in mind the distinction that I made to say that empirical research would involve using your senses. So the question that you need to ask is, if you were to do such an investigation to find out how widespread the practice of corporal punishment is, would you require your senses, or could you sit somewhere in an office and just start writing and producing logical arguments in support to try and find out, to try and answer that particular question? So could you call in or SMS and just SMS 1 or 2? Okay, so we've got some responses now. We're going to ask you some more questions later, so we'd like more people to respond. So some people said 2 and some people said 1. If the first person that responded was Reginald Iso, could we maybe call Reginald and just find out from him why he said number 2? Thank you. Okay, so we're just waiting for Reginald, and we'll hear what his reasons are for choosing number 2. In other words, he said it's an empirical question. Okay. So Reginald is very close. He's in Stellenbosch. He's close to us here, but we're doing this via satellite. So.
Hello.
Hello, Reginald.
Yes.
What was your reason for choosing number 2?
Because I think it's something that can be measured. If one uses a survey in determining at which schools corporal punishment is practiced, and also maybe interviewing learners determine how widespread it is by determining number, then one could possibly make a statement by saying it's widespread if one has physical data to back up one's argument or statement.
Now, can I just ask you, if you wanted to find out how widespread the practice of corporal punishment was, say, in Western Cape schools, what would you actually do to go and find out, whether this practice is widespread? What do you think are some of the things that you would do? You said a questionnaire. So what would you do with the questionnaire, for example?
Well, in the first instance, I would say the manager of the school. I don't know how open he'll be about something that shouldn't be practiced at all. But that could be a way in basically asking the question whether it's practiced or not. And then also, I think to make it more valid is because it's performed on learners to find out whether they have been subjected to it also by means of a questionnaire, I would say. And then one has specific details of districts and provinces that one can use to back up one statement to argument. So basically, I would say a questionnaire would be the way to go.
Okay. We'll take the discussion further. I'll ask one or two other people. If we could find out from Jonathan Fries and just find out what his reason is, if we could contact him. Okay.
It's available.
Okay, if we can try somebody else, if we could try, there was a Heather Malgas, if we could try Heather Malgas. Okay. Okay. So maybe if we can try one last person. Is it Coulson? Selma Coulson. Selma Coulson, yes.
you have called is not available. Please wait.
Okay. It looks as if some of the people are a little camera shy, but we're going to encourage you. And please don't now not respond, later when we ask questions, because I think if the session is more interactive, then the learning experience is going to be more valuable. But look at this particular question. How widespread is the practice of corporal punishment in Western Cape schools? Now, if you were to do an investigation like that, you'd not be able to sit, say, in an office somewhere and write logical arguments and so on. You might be able to consult literature like newspaper articles and so on, but the information that was derived, the people who received the information to write the articles, the journalists and so on, they would have gone to do some empirical work to get their particular information. So you can't sit in an office and just develop logical, arguments and use rational thinking to answer that question. You would have to either visit some of the schools to observe whether corporal punishment is actually taking place, and that would be, using your eyes. You'd have to either talk to people in schools. It could be, the management of the school. It could be parents. It could be learners. To find out from them, and then you have to listen. So you would use your ears in a sense, or you could use questionnaires, as Reginald suggested, which in a sense is extending the powers of your senses to obtain information. So that's definitely an empirical question. Now, how would a theoretical question look like concerning the same particular subject of corporal punishment? That's what I will show you next. If we ask the question, if we can go to the screen, should corporal punishment be used in Western Cape schools? If we ask that question, should corporal punishment be used in Western Cape schools? In other words, ought it to be used? Then that question, you can't answer that question by going to observe or by talking to people and so on. That's going to be based on a particular position that you're going to take. And it would be largely, say, a moral position that you're going to take. You're going to say that it should not be used in schools because it's a form of violence, and violence breeds violence. So that might be your argument. That might be your position, and then you would have to argue for that. Other people might say that it should be used, and they might justify that from a religious point of view, but then they would have to present an argument to justify that. You cannot do that by using your senses or extending your senses. It's based on a position that you're going to take, and that particular position you're going to have to argue for by presenting logical arguments. So I hope that you get some sense of what the difference is between an empirical question and a theoretical question, and what kinds of questions would inform these two broad categories of research: empirical research and theoretical research. I will now move on to another question, and I hope that you will continue to respond to this particular question. If I asked you this question, is an interview a qualitative or a... Oh, sorry, that's a mistake. It should be, is an interview a qualitative or a quantitative technique or method? So is an interview a qualitative or is it a quantitative technique or method? If you think that an interview is a qualitative technique or method, then will you SMS 1? If you think it is a quantitative technique or method, SMS 2. If you think it is both a qualitative and quantitative technique or method, then you answer 3. And if you think it's none of the above, then will you SMS 4? If you can do that for us now. we're back again. So, but what I want to really try and encourage you to actually try to respond. There's not a single, to this particular question, there's not a single right answer. But you've got to start thinking about taking a position and then looking at a way of making an argument and so on. We want to try and, encourage some discussion and to make the session a little more interactive. So what we're going to do is, if I can ask the facilitator in the Stellenbosch venue to ask any particular person there that would like to respond, and then to go on air, to respond to this particular question, and then we can sort of take it from there. Okay. Hello.
This is the facilitator. I'm just waiting for the volunteers. They're all lining up here.
Wonderful, 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 Douglas. Ask Mr. Fries. Ask Mr. Fries if he won't respond.
Mr. Green.
Come on, Johnny.
Hello, sir.
Hello, is that Jonathan Fries?
How would you like me to respond?
I would like you to say whether you're choosing 1, 2, 3, or 4. And you can ask the...
I'm saying that it is a qualitative response because it is an interview. It is one interview. So therefore it cannot be quantitative. Quantitative responses you'll get from a questionnaire where there's more likely a yes-no answer. But when there is an interview, there's an interaction. So you'll get the person's depth of knowledge, understanding and application of knowledge of a particular topic or research question. So it's an iterative process between the person doing the questions and the person responding. So that's a qualitative response.
Okay, thank you very much for your response. Is there perhaps another person that would like to respond in the Stellenbosch venue? You don't have to rush, but I'm sure there is somebody that would like to respond.
They say they've all had their airtime.
Don't they want to come up with, doesn't one person or group of them want to come up with one particular, a different response? Is there perhaps a different view?
They're shaking their head. They all agree. I don't know, they're shaking their head.
Now I hope that they can understand how the learners actually feel in the classroom when they often ask them, to respond to their questions and so on. Anyway, we'll take the discussion further now. So thank you very much for that response. I'm not sure whether that was Jonathan or whether it was Reginald again. So we'll take the discussion further. Now, the most important thing here is there's not necessarily only one answer to this question. But what you would have to do at an honours level is to at least provide a solid academic argument for taking a particular position. So what we're going to do now is to take you through possible ways of making an argument here. And what I'm firstly going to do is to remind you that we had a discussion when you, in the April session, Crystal would have taken you through this particular discussion, and that is to look at research paradigms. And what we said was that we can identify at least 4 different research paradigms. And the first research paradigm would be a positivist research paradigm. The predict there refers to the kind of knowledge interest that this kind of research would have an interest to predict, but the paradigm would be a positivist paradigm. Then you get the next paradigm where the primary knowledge interest would be to understand. We would call that an interpretive paradigm. And then you would get a third paradigm which would have as the knowledge interest to emancipate. And this would be the critical paradigm. And then we also have another, paradigm which has the interest to deconstruct. So that would be a postmodern or post-structuralist paradigm. We'll leave the fourth one for now. But if you were to look at the first 3, then we can say there's a positivist paradigm, there's an interpretive paradigm, and there's a critical paradigm. So those were the 4 research paradigms which we looked at. Now, if one now looks at the next slide, one of the arguments that you can make is what in the one article in your reader, and I'll point you to that article a little later, is to talk about a derivative distinction between the term quantitative and the term qualitative. Now, the derivative distinction relates to from which paradigm would the term qualitative or quantitative from which paradigm would it derive? Okay, that's where the derivative comes from. Now, in the quantitative research, as some people call it, would derive from the positivist paradigm. Okay, if we can go back to the screen. And then if you look at the term qualitative, then it would derive from interpretivism. Now, in the USA, they don't, well, some people do, but there's a large part of the literature which comes from the USA would not talk about a positivist paradigm. They would talk about a quantitative paradigm. And they would not talk about an interpretive paradigm. They will talk about a qualitative paradigm or qualitative research. So when you look at the derivative distinction, then quantitative derives from positivism and qualitative derives from interpretivism. Now, generally, if we can go back to the screen, generally, questionnaires have been aligned with the quantitative paradigm or with positivism. And these are typically closed questionnaires, such as Likert scales, and I'll show you what a Likert scale is if you don't know, or multiple choice questions, which you will be more familiar with, or yes and no, or true and false questionnaires, where there's a definite discrete answer. You can either say yes or no. Those are all closed questions, and I'll tell you now why those type of questionnaires are linked to quantitative research. And then generally, interviews were regarded as being more qualitative techniques or aligned to the interpretive paradigm. So when we look at the derivative distinction, then one can argue that questionnaires are mainly aligned to quantitative research and interviews are linked to qualitative research. That's if you look at the derivative distinction. But there's another distinction that we can make, and that is the literal distinction. There's also a literal distinction that we can make, and the literal distinction concerns the nature of the data or the data. In other words, the technique that you're going to use, whether it is a questionnaire or whether it is an interview, the key issue here is what kind of data will it eventually produce? Will it produce qualitative data or will it produce quantitative data? Now, what do we mean by qualitative data? Qualitative data would be descriptions in words, So rich descriptions in words, prose, narrative, for example, and qualitative data would also include visual images, whether that's produced by video, by the internet, by a standing, by photography, for example, by a camera that will produce photographs. That would also be considered as qualitative data. Quantitative data would be numbers, quantitative indices, statistics. So if the data that's produced by any particular instrument is in the form of numbers or statistics, that will be quantitative data. If it's in the form of visual images or rich descriptions in words, then we will say that that is qualitative data. So this has got to do with the nature of the data. So there's another argument that you can make. You can make an argument to say that if a questionnaire produces quantitative data, then it is a quantitative technique. If it produces qualitative data, then it is a qualitative technique or method. So then the argument would be, if you look at the literal distinction, that a questionnaire can be either a qualitative technique or method, or it can be a quantitative technique or method. Now let's look at an example. A quantitative questionnaire would be something like a Likert scale. Some people, I think in America, call it a Likert scale. Now, a Likert scale you're all familiar with. This is when you get a survey questionnaires, and that survey questionnaire would, for example, ask you to either say you strongly agree with a statement, you agree with it, you're undecided or neutral, you disagree, or you strongly disagree. So you're very familiar with those types of questionnaires. It's called a Likert scale, and it's named after the person who developed these scales for the first time. His surname was Likert. Now, if you were to look at this particular one, and the statement is the introduction of OBE in South Africa, it should be, was necessary to transform education. The introduction of OBE in South Africa was necessary to transform education. So, would your answer be strongly agree? Would it be agree? Would it be undecided? Would it be disagree? Would it be strongly agree? This type of question would be a question that would measure someone's attitude towards outcomes-based education, for example. And this I actually took from a question from one of the honors projects which one of the students produced. Now, if you were to look at that particular question, which would be part of a questionnaire, being part of a survey. Now, let's say you surveyed all teachers in the broader Cape Town area, and you did that by way of a survey, and you got some random sample, and you surveyed teachers. When you get the data for a question like that, what you're going to do is you're going to count. You're going to count how many teachers said strongly agree. You're going to count how many teachers said agree. You're going to count how many teachers were undecided or neutral. You're going to count how many teachers said disagree, and you're going to count how many teachers said strongly disagree. So the data you're going to produce would be numbers. Can you see that in this case, this questionnaire item will produce quantitative data, and the entire questionnaire that this question would be part of would therefore be a quantitative questionnaire. But if you looked at the second example, and I asked on a questionnaire a question like this, it's still a questionnaire, but the question now changes. How are you experiencing the implementation of OBE at your school? That is not an objective type question, it's an open question. And different teachers in different schools, or even the same teachers in the same school, would answer that question differently because the experiences are going to be different. Their experiences are going to be different qualitatively, the experiences are going to be different, and the data you're going to produce there, you would either record by writing down what they're going to say to you. You might use an audio tape, and you will transcribe the audio tape, and what you're going to get there would be rich descriptions in words. So you're going to produce qualitative data. So in this case, the questionnaire is producing qualitative data. So if you look at the literal distinction, then a questionnaire can be both a qualitative and a quantitative technique or method. Let's think about an interview, for example. Now, in most cases, we might think that an interview would be a qualitative technique or method, because in most cases, when you do an interview, you will spend time listening to people and their experiences about a particular thing, and you would record that, and it would produce qualitative data. But we actually don't quite understand what the difference is between a questionnaire and an interview. It does not relate to whether you're listening to, it does not relate to whether it doesn't relate to the one producing qualitative data, the one producing quantitative data, but what it does relate to is whether you're listening to the person or whether the person is actually writing the response. That is the distinguishing factor between a questionnaire and an interview. So that same, if we can go back to the question that we had on the screen, that same question you can actually ask somebody in an interview. You can go and listen to them and have a face-to-face interview with them, and you can listen to them and you can ask them that particular question. You can record it, and you will get the same similar response, and that will be in the form of written descriptions or words, and that would produce qualitative data. But what you can also do is you can take the Likert scale that we had, and you can telephone somebody, or you can telephone a number of teachers across the Western Cape, which you can choose, randomly, say from a list or the CMIS system. You might get information from the Western Cape Education Department, and then you can phone teachers randomly in the Greater Cape Town, and you can ask the same questions on the Likert scale, and you can tick off whether they're saying strongly agree, whether they're saying agree, whether they're saying neutral, disagree or strongly disagree, and you can tick that off, and you can count the number of teachers who are saying that to you. In this case, you've got a telephonic interview, because the interview has got to do with listening to people, but you're still producing quantitative data. In the other case, you can ask the qualitative question like the one we had, and you will actually get qualitative data, but it's still an interview. In the same way, you can ask on a questionnaire a Likert scale type questions, and it can produce quantitative data, but you can also ask a questionnaire. On a questionnaire, you can ask an open-ended question, and the person will write a response that would be rich descriptions in words, and then it will produce qualitative data. So if you look at the literal distinction, then an interview can be both a qualitative method or a quantitative method, because it can produce either qualitative data or quantitative data, and a questionnaire can be a quantitative technique or method or a qualitative technique or method, because an interview can also produce data that would be in the form of numbers or in the form of rich descriptions in words. So if you were to answer a question like this, you can have several arguments, but you can have an argument like this to say that if we look at the derivative distinction between the term quantitative and qualitative, in other words, from which paradigms do they derive, then you can make the argument to say that an interview is a qualitative technique or method, and a questionnaire is a quantitative technique or method. But then you can say, we can also argue, if we look at the literal distinction, that both of those, the interview and the questionnaire, can be both a qualitative method or technique, or it can be a quantitative method or technique. I hope that that is a lot clearer. If you're still unclear about that, then please call in, and then we can try and clarify that. But that's the way in which you would have to formulate your argument. If you're now going to look for where you need to read to find out more information about this in your reader, then it is in an article that I authored, which has the title, Is Qualitative Research a Meaningful Term for Describing the Cross-Fertilization of Ideas which Characterizes Contemporary Educational Research? And it was published in the South African Journal of Education. And the page number in your reader is page 102. So to look for some of the arguments that you could use from the literature is to look at that article, and if you wanted to explore this further, you can look at the reference list there. One of the key people that has written a lot about this is Kenneth Howe, and his reference is there, and you can go further. You can Google Kenneth Howe to look for some of his more recent work on this particular debate to take the discussion further. But let us move on. If I now asked you, and I'm going to ask you to respond, even if your response is not correct, and I will not put you under pressure this time to ask you to justify to all of us what your answer is. I'm just going to ask you now to respond to this particular question by SMSing your answer, and I will not ask you I won't identify individuals, so Mr. Fries, you don't have to worry. But if you can, please SMS your response, and can we get as many responses as possible from different centers across the country. So if I asked you this particular question, which validity type is not associated with positivism? Which one would you choose? Would you choose one, content validity? Would you choose construct validity? Would you choose catalytic validity? Or would you choose criterion-related validities? If you could try and respond to that question, just SMS 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I will not put you under any pressure, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, we're back again now. You're not being very helpful tonight. I know you're disappointed that you can't be at the movies. I said it is half price on a Tuesday. But one person, thankfully, did respond. Oh, no, so there are more responses. If we can just maybe give them another minute or so, maybe we'll get more responses. Thank you very much for your responses. And guess what? Everybody that responded said number 3. Now, I'm sure that you did that because you worked through your reader and as well as through your study guide, quite a few times over the last 6 months or so. Or you could just have paged to something like this, which is in your study guide, which we might have done, and it would have been easy to identify and see that catalytic falls under critical. I just didn't repeat the others, that falls under interpretive, because that would be the same. Those would be the same validity types or ways of ensuring trustworthiness in research. So I didn't repeat that, but catalytic is definitely, clearly falls under the critical paradigm. I'll say something about that in a second. But the easy way would have been to just go to the study guide and just look and see that it's number 3. But I'm sure you didn't do that. I'm sure you actually worked through a lot of this work on your own. And if I were to call you now, which I won't, I promise that I wouldn't, you'd be able to give me a solid reason as to why catalytic validity falls under the critical paradigm. But if we go back to the screen and look at validity types and research paradigms, this is one particular area that you also need to understand and know very well. So when it comes to positivism, it's content validity, construct validity, criterion-related validities. Interpretive research, it's intersubjective objectivity. Face validity or member checking, thick description, triangulation. These are also used in critical research, but the important one that's different there is catalytic validity. And then in the postmodern, it's very complex and difficult validity types like rhizomatic validity, verisimilitude, reflexivity, transgressive validity, and so on. We don't have the time to go into all of the details of this now, because you've done this work already in the April session. But what we will do, and I think is important, we don't have an article. We have one particular article in there, in your reader, which is the one by Tony Bush, but we'd like to give you an additional article, and we'll make that additional article available through Moodle. or we will tell you how to access this article through South African e-publications, which you can do electronically through the library if you have access to the internet. So if we'll make that available through the faculty office, and I will ask Crystal to talk to the people at the faculty office to make that available to you, and that will help you to actually read further about these different validity types and how validity types are linked to research paradigms. But let me just say something about catalytic validity to explain to you what that particular one is all about. Now, catalytic, the term there relates to the idea of a catalyst. So a catalyst is something that speeds up, for example, a chemical reaction without whatever the catalyst is playing a direct role in the particular chemical process and so on. So, but a catalyst is something that speeds up something. Now, when we say research has catalytic validity, then it would mean that the research process itself will act as a catalyst that will lead to emancipation. Now, the emancipation that we're talking about here is not necessarily political emancipation, it's not necessarily social emancipation, but it is about the emancipation of the mind. It's what Paulo Freire, for example, spoke about, conscientization. It's what people spoke about, the decolonization of the mind. So we're talking here about the liberation of the mind. And if research leads to this form of liberation, then we can say the research was a catalyst to bring about, liberation. So let me use an example. People working within the critical paradigm would, for example, see teachers who operate in the contemporary world as being people who have been systematically de-skilled over the years. And they would argue that teachers are not teachers anymore. But what teachers are, they're technicians. They've been disempowered, systematically de-skilled, and because they're not involved anymore in real curriculum development, they don't make the decisions, the key decisions about what is best for their learners to learn in a school, even though they know the learners best. What teachers do today is they implement things that have been decided by other people, curriculum planners, it might be academics, it might be people who work in education departments. They decide what the curriculum framework is. They produce all kinds of guideline documents for teachers, and all that teachers need to do is they need to implement what others have decided. Now, they would call people like that technicians. And so what this kind of research would do would involve processes that would make teachers aware of how they've been systematically de-skilled, and to empower them to take control over a number of decisions that affect learning processes in classrooms, and would get teachers involved in processes like curriculum development through participatory action research processes. And if the research then does lead to the emancipation of teachers, to teachers critically questioning their current status, then one would say that research has catalytic validity. In practice, in many of the studies who've attempted to do this, it's very difficult to show that this kind of research is successful, but theoretically that's what it actually means. So that brings us to the end of the first session. We're going to have a 10-minute break, but before we have a 10-minute break, I'm just going to ask Crystal whether she would like to say something or just add something to what we've discussed so far.
Professor, with regards to the validity that we've just spoke about, Some students, with regards to the assignments, some students still tend not to mention how they have applied the different types of validity. For example, they would mention face validity or thick descriptions or what the case might be, or content validity, but there's no sign of how they have actually applied the validity. So if I could just ask you maybe to elaborate more on that section in your assignments, because I've seen some of the first drafts, and then to just mention how you've actually specifically when it gets to the questions, that you've maybe consulted experts within the same field or other teachers or colleagues or whatever, just to make reference to that. So, yeah.
Okay, what we will do is we will discuss, we can pick that up in the next session when we talk about the assignment, and we can use, say, for example, content validity, and we can help them to with ways of ensuring content validity in their particular project and so on. So we'll discuss that in the last half an hour or so of the next session. We will have a 10-minute break, so we'll come back at about 10 past 7. Thank you.